We're going to move on to the final panel on visualization. So it's hardly contentious here at the School of Architecture that to discuss visualization or representation of the environment is to invoke the three terms that we have used already today: history, politics, and uncertainty. And we saw this clearly in the talks earlier this morning through the cartography of Habsburg climatology or environmental disease vectors, graphs of climatic normativity, or conflict shorelines. So then we might ask, what are the current visualization systems, protocols, technologies, and representational rhetorics? So speaking of Levi-Strauss, in reference to Levi-Strauss, famously, Jacques Derrida described what he called the inflation of the sign language in the post-war. And by this, he referred to the increased value of language, but also to its pronounced visibility, applicability, and ubiquity within disciplines as far-ranging as the social sciences, the humanities, and cybernetics. We can say that especially for architecture, there was a similar, if not identical, inflation of the sign environment in the post-war, marked most directly by the pedagogical institutional transformation of schools of architecture to colleges of environmental design, beginning with UC Berkeley in 1959. Yet what this inflated sign signified remained somewhat uncertain and unstable. It encompassed the merging of architecture with the social sciences, the undoing of the centrality of building form, the engagement with the city and biologically oriented urban growth theories, as well as encounters with questions related to ecology and climate, which dominate the discussion of environment today for the discipline. But generally, we can say that environment appeared as a code for a thing, space, system, atmosphere, that is either impacting, altering, affecting us in ways that may be unknown and invisible, or that we are impacting, affecting, altering in ways that may be similarly unknown or invisible. So it served as the architectural demarcator of various sites of crisis, from urban conflict to pollution to the effects of mediatic spaces and computation to ensuing behavioral modification. So environment appeared both ubiquitous and invisible, theoretically densely articulated and yet elusive. It was a term, and may still be a term, or condensation of effects that penetrates architecture to the point of disciplinary redefinition, and yet how it is described, located, or known within architecture was far from conclusive or without conflict. Hence, how environment is represented, how it is made knowable, visible, is simultaneously saturated with these conflicts and a range of discursive, disciplinary effects and conclusions. Think of the calculus of life and death within every model that Adrian so chillingly invoked. And so environment also marks the outside of architecture, its structural, atmospheric, climatological exterior, a term that both defines and tests the limit of architecture, and yet simultaneously points to forms of disciplinary expansion. Or to put this somewhat differently, the extension of architecture into its environmental condition occurs at one important level, politically, historically, uncertainly, through its representational inscription into environment. Our talks today will ask about the status of current environmental visualization, and will examine what is at stake within what we might then call the second 21st century wave of environmental inscription. Our first speaker is Heather Davis, a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at Pennsylvania State University, where she is working on a project that traces the ethology of plastic as a materialization of the philosophic division of the subject and object. Please welcome Heather.
Okay, how do I see that? Oh, there we go. And where is, okay, good. Sorry. Thank you so much for sticking around. Thanks to all the organizers for putting this conference on. It's been a really incredible day, and I'm so pleased to be a part of this. What I'm about to present is in part connected to a recent publication where I argued that the aggregate of what we're calling the ecological crisis in this publication, picking up on the terminology of the Anthropocene, is primarily an aesthetic event. And I argued this in three ways, which is one, that primarily what's happening is a reorientation and disorientation of our senses. So thinking about as the aesthetic through the notion of aesthesis. Secondly, obviously through the fact that most of our knowledge about what's happening with climate change is happening by way of visualization. And thirdly, that the arts primarily can provide a place where the complexity of what we're dealing with can address us on an existential level. And that's mainly what I'm going to be presenting today. So the human-sized rectangular glass box emits a slow whoosh, a pause, and then again, it sighs. Inside the box are leaves slowly decomposing, and as they decompose, they exhale, a sound made audible to our ears through the use of carbon dioxide sensors. Ventilation fans on either side of the box open and close like gills. This is the breath of the earth as it is transforming, moving through the processes of decay to nourish the soil. As the leaves exhale the carbon they have been storing throughout their lives, it moves into the atmosphere. Molecular structures exchange and transform. As they breathe out, exhale, the leaves become molecular. This 2008 work, Inhale, Exhale, by Finnish artist Terikka Hapoja, which was exhibited in the installation Closed Circuit Open Duration at the Venice Biennale in 2013, and I should specify that it's the art one and not the architecture one in this context, attunes us effectively to the carbon cycle. The numeracy of climate crisis, the endless barrage of numbers and statistics, here gives way to breath, to the sound of breath, to the sound of the breath of the leaves, of the soil. To the exhale, we then inhale. Climate statistics pulled inside our lungs. Levels of carbon dioxide and methane and oxygen registered as vibration. Hapoja says, I quote, "It is not enough to show the workings of carbon in the ecosystem. We need to try to see what CO2 means to us. How does it work our way into our own inner reality, the reality of love and bodily being and death? The story of the carbon cycle is the story of things passing in and out of existence, of transformation, of composition and decomposition." Hapoja proposes that these cycles are intimate, pulled into our most constitutive and basic elements of being. I would like to take up this proposition. How, in the midst of the political debates about carbon dioxide, and carbon economies, currently taking place in Paris, might a shift in discourse towards affective attunement, towards an intimate engagement with the molecular, augment or intervene in those politics? Carbon is arguably the most important molecule in an age that has been increasingly framed through the figure of the molecule. In the 20th and 21st century, the molecule has come to define our bodies and the world around us. It is the primary scientific figure visualizing the inner workings of the world. We understand our sense of self, history, and ethnicity through the fetishization of DNA, just as we alter our bodies through other molecules such as oxytocin, serotonin, estrogen, and testosterone. In other words, we manufacture our subjectivities, especially our gendered identities, on the molecular scale. Similarly, we are asked to think about climate change through molecular composition. including the levels of carbon dioxide, methane, etc. We increasingly understand ourselves, our identities, and our political realities through the frame of the molecule. So what are the affordances and foreclosures of this framing, especially in relation to contemporary environmental crisis and climate justice? For even as the effects of climate change are being felt and observed in so many communities around the world, as we've so very clearly seen today, scientific data, despite the incredible efforts of all of the people that we've heard, also remains abstract for many people. And the carbon molecule is at the heart of this abstraction. The molecular is a historically contingent product of scientific knowledge, with precursors in ancient Greece, such as Leucippus and Empedocles, through to the thought of Lucretius, to more sustained considerations beginning in the 17th century. In 1873, James Maxwell Clerk, in a paper published in Nature, claimed that a molecule was the smallest possible portion of a particular substance. No one has ever seen or handled a single molecule. Molecular science, therefore, is one of those branches of study which deal with things invisible and imperceptible by our senses, and which cannot be subjected to direct experiments. The molecule is the making abstract of the observable world. The molecular institutes a world beyond our senses, which pushes at the limits of the human sensorium and seems to invite the kind of technological processes that we take for granted today. And it wasn't until 2009 that IBM took the first picture of a molecule, which corresponds remarkably well to the diagrams that have been in use since the early 20th century. The molecule, as the basis of materiality, as rendering matter knowable and manipulable to the wills and whims of the chemical industry, is ultimately also pure information or pure capital. As the Critical Art Ensemble wrote over a decade ago, any form of molecular capital can now be appropriated. It is an open frontier. As with all named and controllable objects, now genomes, enzymes, biochemical processes, etc., will all be privatized. What was once communal and controlled by traditional authority and common understanding is now usurped by separating its molecular or chemical value from its holistic phenotypic value. And this is in part what is happening in the current climate debates. The structures of commonality are being broken down by the market, the private interests, and by national negotiations. And as Adrian very aptly pointed out, the carbon molecule itself poses this problem of universality. So the molecule or molecular is also a significant figure in contemporary philosophy, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Deleuze and Guattari together, and Guattari in his own writings, take the figure of the molecule as central to an anti-capitalist movement. Molecules oppose the category of the molar as they articulate the processes of movement, of being in between, of the interstitial that escapes the confines of the definition of a subject or object, the movement that they call becoming. They say, quote, all becomings are molecular. The animal, flower, or stone one becomes are molecular collectivities, hexaides, not molar subjects, objects, or form that we know from the outside and recognize from experience through science or by habit, end quote. This description of the molecular offers what is radical and urgent in our engagement with ecological crisis, that there is no possibility of barricading, containing, or sealing ourselves off. We are radically open, radically constituted by the molecular outside. We breathe in each other's air, and despite air conditioning and all the attenuating accoutrements of the wealthy, there is no way to shield against this molecular becoming. This radical openness to the outside is what both links us to the world and to what threatens us. Writer, and of course, obviously this doesn't happen in any kind of an equal way. Clearly there are some who are more threatened than others, and for very particular reasons. Writer Elias Canetti, on the occasion of Herman Brock's 50th birthday, wrote in relation to his friend's literature, it is the defenselessness of breathing which I would like to talk about in conclusion. One can hardly form too great a notion of it. To nothing is a man so open as to the air. Air is the last common property. It belongs to all people collectively. And this last thing which has belonged to all of us collectively shall poison all of us collectively. Molecular becoming, the carbon cycle, and breath render the body both vulnerable while providing the basis of the argument for the necessity of an atmospheric commons. This is at once a political and affective project, a project constituted in and through the filling and emptying of the lungs again and again. It is a project that ties us to our fellow creatures and also to the organic and the inorganic. Amy Balkin's 2004 to 2012 project Public Smog is one artistic proposition for asserting the air as a commons. In this work, she attempted to submit Earth's atmosphere for inscription on UNESCO's World Heritage List, which was unsuccessful. The project also consisted of purchasing and retiring emissions in regulated emissions markets, making it impossible for polluters to purchase them. And I think that if we were to scale this up, it could be really quite interesting. In each of these ways, Balkin is asserting the right to the air as a commons, and does so by intervening into United Nations rights and discourses, as well as by using the privatization of the air to retire emissions, creating public space in the sky, or what she calls a clean air park. In a different valence, Susanna Hertrich, and I'll just start. Offers a tool for molecular becoming. Her proposition is less about the commons than about the possibility of futurity and the necessity to become with animals and techno-objects as a matter of survival. Jacobson's fabulous olfactometer, a sensorial prosthesis, is worn on the head and triggers the Flehmen response in the wearer when air pollution levels become too high. The Flehmen response, which is seen in horses, elk, goats, young elephants, felines, and other animals, is characterized by a raising of the front lip to transfer air containing pheromones and other scents to the veromonasal, or Jacobson's organ, a chemosensory organ located between the roof of the mouth and the palate. The animal uses the response to detect non-volatile organic compounds like urine and hormones. In the human prostheses, the movement becomes a warning device. Jacobson's fabulous olfactometer is a prosthetic becoming animal. The boundaries of the human sensorium are extended in an adaptation adequate to the molecular threat that we have induced in our environment. Capitalism molecularized as the output of fossil fuels, particulate matter, persistent organic pollutants, plastics, flame retardants, and hormones. Do not imitate a dog, Deleuze and Guattari write, but make your organism enter into composition with something else, in such a way that the particles emitted from the aggregate, thus composed, will be canine as a function of the relation of movement and rest, or of molecular proximity into which they enter. This becoming animal that is figured as the future of human life, an accelerated human evolution driven by existing technology, is meant to help us cope with extreme environments. This prosthesis is a kind of involutionary momentum, a transversal space that adapts a response meant, most often, for sexual pleasure, here turned to a world of threat, but that still retains the capacity for play and excitable communication. It is an achievement, in the sense that Isabel Stengers means, as a collective participation of more than human agencies in a changing world. The molecule is a figure of contradiction. While it affords the privatization of life itself, it also defies that hubris. Its endless movements, its constant becomings, call attention to the ways in which none of us are us, but rather composed of everyone else, of everything else. And in this offers the possibility of an ethics of commonality and of the commons that resists enclosure by both national state interests and private enterprise. It makes apparent the ways that we are vulnerable to each other, how we are indebted to each other, and how we are doomed together. The molecular offers a framework to reattune our entangled relations with the world around us through its perpetual movement and its disregard of the moral categories of the human, animal, leaf, soil, or atmosphere. If we understand our bodies as the temporary stability of a particular form of carbon that inevitably circulates, passing through other bodies, the earth and the atmosphere, how might this shift our relation to climate change? How might we understand this particular moment as one not just of crisis, but as a point of connection, as a necessary call for a commonality of carbon? And how might we do this without being naive about the deaths that the chemical revolution has left in its wake, deaths that have happened and those that are foretold? And I want to just end with a brief quote from a poem by Juliana Spar, where she writes, "How connected we are with everyone The space that has been inside of everyone, mixing inside of everyone with nitrogen and oxygen and water vapor and argon and carbon dioxide and suspended dust spores and bacteria, mixing inside of everyone with sulfur and sulfuric acid and titanium and nickel and minute silicon particles from pulverized glass and concrete. How lovely and how doomed this connection of everyone with lungs. Thank you.
Next up is our very own Laura Kurgan, Associate Professor of Architecture here at GSAPP, and where she is director also for the Center for Spatial Research and the Visual Studies sequence. Laura.
Okay. So which is this the button? Huh? I want to use this. Will it work? Okay. Okay. So we've heard a lot about this today, that climate change is famously hard to grasp. It seems to pose fundamental obstacles to representation. Although it has been moving slowly, it seems to have produced little impact in the human sensorium. We can't look at the world and see climate change, nor can we smell it or hear it unless an acute crisis emerges. In the richest sense, though, climate change is not simply a tricky thing to be represented, a problem to be solved with representation, but it poses a fundamental crisis of representation. It seems in a way that Latour has taught us both to demand representation and to remove the very conditions that makes representation possible. If climate change is the human artifact par excellence, while at the same time threatening our very existence, how can humans take ownership and responsibility for it? How can we imagine something so deeply unsettling to our own capacity to imagine? Obviously, people are trying, and I thought I'd survey some of those attempts. Most of them depend on what are called models, and we've seen a lot of them today. They are mathematical and abstract. And as a problem of representation, engaging with climate change demands translation from the models. To make models, we take measurements, we record data, and then we subject those figures to a massive complex of observed patterns and assumptions about the way climate works. What comes out are more numbers, and representing climate change fundamentally is about the presentation of these numbers in other languages. More often than not, to represent or to see those results, we try to translate those data into pictures. Okay. No, that's the end. We need to go to the beginning. Can you go to the beginning of the presentation? Yeah. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So one of the most popular visualizations of climate change is the hockey stick graph. It shows global warming temperature changing over the last 100 years or so to indicate a process of exponential increases in global temperature. Al Gore, in his landmark keynote presentations, documented in An Inconvenient Truth, climbs a ladder to make the rise in temperature a bit more visceral. But still, it's very abstract. I don't know if you remember that.
You've heard of off the charts.
Okay. There are ways you can see and hear climate changing, somewhat less abstractly, that are still based in recorded data. And you can count animals, measure ice, record temperature, and take photographs over time. I'll show you two creative renditions of this. Bernie Krause has been recording time over the last 50 years in places with changing ecologies. He calls this ecoacoustics, and he visualizes these sounds with spectrograms. This is a spectrogram up here on the wall. The frequency of the sound, as well as its location, allows you to interpret what the sound is. Although he's done work in the Amazon and in Chernobyl, incredible work in Chernobyl, he's done among other places, the spectrogram comes from a somewhat a bit closer. This, what you're seeing on the screen, is a before and after sound clip. As the world goes silent in Sugarloaf near San Bernardino because of the effects of drought. On the other hand, and a lot of people have shown this today, the New York Times visualized the Marshall Islands sinking. Josh Hammer used a hovering drone to show his readers how land is quite simply disappearing. The flooded urbanscape is gradually entering into the rhetorical handbook of climate change figuration. Is it moving? Yeah. Along with the polar bear, abandoned on the melting ice, and the underwater session of the Maldives parliament. Still, today, the most charismatic icon of climate change is a so-called blue marble. First photographed in 1973, it shows a vulnerable Earth with no borders. It doesn't show change, and so it does not work the way we are asking for, but for some reason, it remains there as an image of a vulnerable globe. We tried to put that blue marble, or its new incarnation, the composited new blue marble, into motion in a project I recently did. It's a very large collaboration, and you can see all the names of the collaborators there on the advertisement. And we updated it for COP21. It's now on display in Paris at the Palais de Tokyo, called Exit. And that's what I'm going to really focus on showing you today. It's a 360-degree panorama, and it visualizes the economic, political, and environmental reasons for which people move around the world. I don't have enough time today to argue why all the parts relate to climate change, and so I'm going to focus on 3 parts that focus specifically on climate-induced migration. An updated blue marble still serves as that icon of vulnerability, but now it assumes a productive role. It spins around a panoramic room, delaminating and imprinting data sets as it rotates. So in our visualization of climate change, we have no hockey stick graphs, no pictures of people, no figurative images of any kind. What we have is data about people, specifically and only about people, as the base for animating a series of maps about the reasons those people are moving around the world. And we don't even draw complete maps. Our data sets are rendered to only show what they include and projected geographically. You see the geographies, especially here, of inequity. We are interested in one fact above all others. Those who are most responsible for climate change are those who are the least affected by it, and vice versa. So the data sets are curated and contextualized. Most often, we have 2 data sets in relation to one another. No data set here is neutral. It is collected by specific agencies for specific purposes, and no data set even has a perfect count of people either. But they do allow us to grasp the magnitude of displacement. Okay. So working on the update of this project this fall was sobering. We did it the first time in 2008 and now in 2014. So in 2008, our map showed 6 billion people in the world. In 2007, 7 billion, and that was from a data set called the Gridded Population of the World, generated by Season up at Lamont Doherty. In 2008, there were 11 to 12 million refugees. By 2014, they are now between 59 and 60 million. In 2006, 60 million people were displaced by floods, while by 2014, our data shows twice as many, almost 120 million displaced people. But numbers are just one mode and are not the most compelling one of making this attempt at representation. So instead, what I want to show you are the visuals which we produced in an attempt to show climate change differently and to create a language for telling the story. So the next 8 minutes really are just showing you an edited version of what's on display now in Paris. used the gridded population of the world, and then we used a database called MDAT, which records people who had been affected by the flood and overlaid it onto that data set. Actually not updated, so it was for the 2009 COP conference. So this 1 meter level is now 2 meters. Yeah. Today.
kwansat kin wanteten hen wanteten jo ponen niki kwantetek man hen niki Oi, kaku.
Thank you, Laura. Our next speaker is Emily Eliza Scott, who is currently a postdoc in architecture at the ETH in Zurich. She's an interdisciplinary scholar, artist, and former park ranger. Emily.
Great, it's already there. Thank you so much to my fellow speakers for their brilliant inputs today, not least on this very panel, and to the organizers for inviting me. It's a tremendous honor to be here. Before I start or begin my talk, I wanted to mention that I've just wrapped up teaching a seminar at ETH Zurich on climate change, which aimed to render, this is the poster for the class obviously, which aimed to help render this unwieldy topic both less abstract and to bring its sort of complexities and contingencies into clearer focus. So each week we honed in on a particular site. These sites varied widely in scale and type, from the atmosphere itself to low-lying Pacific islands to the COP21 meetings in Paris, linked to particular facets of climate change: geopolitical, legal, ecological, infrastructural, and so on. So like a series of knotted and in some cases nested case studies, the structure of the class itself really reflected my own attempt, if itself imperfect, to build an adequate response to the same representational conundrums that I'm going to address today. And very much in line with this symposium, my students and I have been wrangling with the questions: at what scales does architecture intersect with climate change, and to what extent does climate change demand a rethinking and reconfiguration of the field? Perhaps more than any other phenomenon imaginable, climate change is dizzyingly convoluted, entailing many often correlated and at times seemingly contradictory things happening at multiple places at once, at varying rates and scales, and with myriad types and degrees of consequence. In addition to certain unprecedented material environmental conditions, it thus poses profound representational dilemmas. The writer Rebecca Solnit portrays, quote, "Climate change is everything, a story and a calamity bigger than any other. It is the whole planet for the whole foreseeable future, the entire atmosphere, all the oceans, the poles, its weather and crop failure and famine and tropical diseases headed north, and desertification, and the uncertain fate of a great majority of species on Earth," unquote. We are moreover immersed in this ever-accelerating everythingness, the edges of which are difficult, if not impossible, to sense. The term dysphoria, from Greek for difficult to bear, denotes a profound state of unease that can also, in a psychiatric context, mean someone who becomes ever more uncomfortable in her own body or skin. Common reactions to dysphoria apparently involve emotional distress or, conversely, indifference. I borrow this concept in part from Emily Apter's 2013 essay, Planetary Dysphoria, in which she considers a pervasive end-of-times consciousness or a dark ecological vision. She speaks about it in terms of geotrauma today. I think also of several recent articles about growing cases of depression among leading climate change scientists, what some are now referring to as climate anxiety or pre-traumatic stress disorder. From what vantage point, then, might we engage climate change, this multi-scalar, multi-temporal, multi-dimensional, and multidisciplinary shadow that is no less ominous because it is formless and obscure, to borrow Rachel Carson's analogy for pesticide contamination from 1962? What kinds of representations, visual and otherwise, my talk is not so visualization-oriented, are adequate to the subject, perhaps most importantly, in order to spur critical thinking and action, maybe first by needing to stem a kind of dysphoric paralysis. The existing visual culture of climate change brims with images of apocalyptic environmental collapse, polar bears atop waning ice, and satellite views from above. While I don't have time to discuss science fiction today, the current abundance of dystopian end-of-world imagery certainly warrants attention. A resurgence of this genre is clearly underway, both within popular media and among some very interesting artists and experimental scholars. I do want to briefly consider, however, the two other tropes I mentioned. First, the iconic lone animal, which also appeared in Laura's presentation, struggling for survival amid its rapidly changing or disappearing habitat. As with countless other depictions of the earth and its beings in peril, a single tragic victim here occupies center stage. Our view is proximate at the human scale. Imbued with pathos, this picture is journalistic and allegorical at once. At the other scalar extreme is the equally prevalent technoscientific representation of the Earth's surface garnered from the quasi-external, top-down vantage point of an orbiting satellite, in this case showing the retreat of ice in the Northwest Passage. And if we have time and there's interest in the discussion, it would be great, I think, if we spent some time talking about this highly charged figure and scale of the global and also that of the planetary. I'm really curious about the global in terms of how it's being invoked to sort of quite often in Anthropocene discourse. It's also a scale at which many climate models operate. And I'm in addition curious about how the Anthropocene and climate change sort of line up relative to one another. So moving back to what I was saying. So despite their differences, both of these image types, the tragic photograph and the technological satellite image or view, adhere, I want to argue, to an illustrative or figurative mode. Like a related explanatory mode, I believe that this mode, this manner, is largely incongruous, even mute, in the face of newly complex entanglements between the human and non-human, not to mention the kind of attritional, slow violence associated with climate change. Both presuppose the possibility of documenting objective single truths, and as such are fundamentally too literal, blunt, or clunky. Both the close-up and the distant perspective, moreover, tend to blur or occlude crucial specificities, contexts, conflicts, and contingencies. We might think of these as scales that often depoliticize. Solnit offers an example of a newly built solar plant in California, which has caused the rather spectacular deaths of a number of birds via mid-air incineration in a newspaper article she wrote called "Are We Seeing or Are We Losing the Big Picture of Climate Change?" Citing the media's propensity to focus on the loss of such individuals, many times by way of imaging a solitary charred bird, she insists that this emphasis on foreground comes at the dire expense of the big picture perspective, which would be one that would push us to think at the scale of whole habitats and the potential loss thereof, or in terms of the respective impacts of a fossil fuel-based versus an alternative energy-based economy. Quote, "The stories about individual birds can distract us from the slow motion calamity that will eventually threaten every bird," she warns. Indeed, one of the key challenges is how to maintain a degree of resolution fine-grained enough to capture interrelations that are dispersed across time and space and that are often radically asymmetrical. So in his own work on climate forensics, Adrian Lahoud, who we heard from already today, and he spoke about this, considers the example of the 2-degree warming limit that has become a de facto target of global warming policy. We heard the update also from Michael Gerard today that it's now being renegotiated and may move up to a 3.5. So keep that in mind. So Lahoud explains, quote, "The violent abstraction of a global average negates the uneven scale of climate impact and erases the specificity of a people from its calculation. A 2-degree average increase globally would allow for a catastrophic 3.5-degree increase in many places, and we can only imagine if that goes up how much more catastrophic it would be. So in line with other climate activists, especially those from the global south, he calls for a, quote, different scale of calculus, one that would possess just enough resolution to catch the uneven effects of temperature increase, unquote. So we might then think of this or describe this as a scale for potential political intervention. To return to my original question, from what position might we build, mobilize, and operationalize more adequate representations of climate change? And I want very quickly here to turn to the ideas of the anthropologist Anna Tsing, who in her 2005 book, Friction and an Ethnography of Global Connection, proposes that it is necessary to begin again and again in the middle of things. For where, in fact, is something like the global, or climate change we might extend, situated, global connection, she puts forth, can only be charged and enacted in the sticky materiality of practical encounters. So it is to friction, what she characterizes as the awkward, unequal, unstable, and creative qualities of interconnection across difference, that our attentions must turn. Extending from this, like certain others, I want to advocate for perspectives that are highly situated, yet that move across scales and registers. And I mean both spatial scales, the so-called local and global, and temporal ones too, historical time, evolutionary time, and media. Distinct from an ocular-oriented zooming in and out, we might think here of Charles and Ray Eames's 1977 film, Powers of 10, it is representations that engage multiple, ultimately incommensurable registers, whether they're molecular, bacterial, geological, geopolitical, architectural, chemical, visible, invisible, material, or speculative, some combination of those, and so on, that most suit our present moment of climate change. In the remaining minutes, I want to introduce an ongoing project called A People's Archive of Sinking and Melting, initiated in 2011 by the California-based artist Amy Balkin. And to be clear, it is the same Amy Balkin that Heather Davis just spoke about. She spoke about a different project, Public Smog. So I want to offer this up as a kind of example of what I think is a super compelling model of what I was just referring to. Balkin describes this piece as a, quote, collection of materials contributed by people living in places that may disappear because of the combined physical, political, and economic impacts of climate change. Together, they form an archive of what will have been, unquote. The artifacts thus amassed, of modest scale and carrying oblique reference to both their sites and acts of collection, the artist is clear that anything that happens to be there is welcome, include, among other things, a desiccated mango pit plucked from the shoreline of a small village in Senegal, a pebble from the 9th Ward of New Orleans, and a nautical hook from Palmer Station on Anvers Island in Antarctica. This participatory archive is rooted in mundane objects that together bear situated polyvocal witness to real and projected events. While reminiscent of an 18th century Wunderkammer in terms of its eclecticism, this bevy of curiosities is not meant to consolidate one vision or experience of the world, but to the contrary, to serve as community-gathered evidence, that's one of her terms, or as a public record, another of her descriptions. It is counterfactual documentation she is building, both political and elegiac in tone. Now, there's obviously much to discuss here, but I'll just touch on a few things, a few aspects of this highly layered project. First, the specimens of mostly everyday detritus comprising the archive are not abstracted or calibrated in order to become part of a cohesive whole, but instead maintain their material specificity and oddity. Balkin refers to them as common but differentiated, drawing this term in principle from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, in which it was used to acknowledge the common but differentiated responsibilities between developed industrialized nations that are most responsible for climate change and thus carry a heavier burden than those least responsible and most affected. In so doing, she ushers her own gesture into the sphere of environmental law and more specifically environmental justice. And really, many of her works for a decade at least have been sort of in that sphere. The archive, in a permanent state of unfinishedness, is oriented towards an unknown and uncertain future, yet situated firmly in the present. In this sense, it is neither escapist nor geared toward an imagined alternative future, something invoked in many a contemporary art and design project, often with distinctly utopian overtones. It addresses a peculiar temporality, what Balkin refers to as the future anterior, which asks us to, quote, think forward in time to look back, unquote. That's her description. In a recent interview with the art historian T.J. Damos, she addressed this doubling of temporal perspectives, saying that the archive simultaneously serves as, quote, a time capsule for a near future in which hundreds of millions of people are likely to be displaced, and a public display of evidence for a present when grave mistakes are being made, unquote. I want to also just add that I find this project's aim to construct a forum for unofficial, kind of collective, not entirely collective, but sort of many people's unofficial long-term memories, particularly poignant in light of our own accelerated age of quick-fire obsolescence. So to close, a people's archive of sinking and melting is a representation, if we want to even call it that, which dwells in the sticky materiality of practical encounters in order to forge not a seamless perspective, but rather one that is adequately fractured and muddy. In contrast to a technoscientific view from above, its objects acts reflect positions on the ground. Any notion of a fixed or isolated location, however, is troubled and replaced by a loose set of alliances drawn between places that are undergoing related processes of environmental destruction. At the same time that embedded perspectives are invoked, this archive is not political in a straightforward or instrumental sense. Rather, Balkin is interested or curious, as she has been in previous projects, about, quote, what the shape of political resistance in the difficult to inhabit space of the atmosphere might look like, unquote. It is strangely fitting that climate change, this biggest of imaginable phenomena, this thing which is everything, assumes the form of a motley assembly. An assembly that does not depict or explain, that does not coalesce into a single picture, that sits between an unfolding present and imminent or imagined futures, that entails a series of non-monumental acts, each performed with great care, from the drawing of artifacts from their found contexts, to the recordings of their details, to the methodological maintenance of the archive by the artist. And finally, this archive that invites us to begin cobbling various, inevitably partial and imperfect views of the world, ones refracted perhaps through a mud-soaked slipper, an abandoned seashell, a crumbled wrapper, or some such.
Our final speaker of this final panel this afternoon is Niran Turin, an architect and partner of NEMA Studio. She's currently an assistant professor at Rice University School of Architecture. Thank you, Niran.
How do I move forward? How do I?
I forward the slide?
Okay, it's fine. So many thanks for the organizers for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be here, really, and being among a stunning collection of minds. My work focuses on the relationship between geography and design to open up new aesthetic and political lines of inquiry within architecture and urbanism. Rather than seeing geography's potential merely as an analytical tool of visual description or just as an expansion of scale, my work aims at developing dialogues between aesthetics and engagement through the potentials of architectural imagination. Aligned with this interest, my earlier work focused on particular interactions between geometry and geography through, for instance, a study of the energy landscapes of the North Sea during the 60s to historicize the relations of oil and space, while making visible some of the physical, social, and representational geographies within a transnational and geopolitical context. The research framed the domain of the spatial and the territorial through the study of what I called a latent landscape, a landscape that is invisible simply because of remaining outside of ecology's focus on the natural and wilderness and of urbanism's focus on the city, but plays a central role in the production and conception of what is known to us as the built environment. These questions have played an important role for other research and publication projects I have worked on, such as the founding of the New Geographies Journal publication, which proposes the emergence of a geographic paradigm in design today and examines the expanded environmental agency of the designer within our contemporary culture. My current research continues to investigate these questions with a particular focus on the relationship between the representational and the material. And I'm going to present some of that research to you today. In his 2009 book, Why Do We Disagree About Climate Change?, geographer and professor of climate and culture Mike Hulme writes, quote, "Climate change is not a problem waiting for a solution. It is an environmental, cultural, and political phenomenon that is reshaping the way we think about ourselves, about our societies, and about humanity's place on Earth." Rather than seeing climate change, it's not me, it's Mike Hulme. Rather than seeing climate change as an environmental phenomenon to prevent, control, or master, we must approach it as an imaginative resource around which our collective and personal identities and projects can and should take shape. There are different ways of portraying this reimagination of climate change, as a cultural term, as a term which stands in for something else, or as a crisis in representation, unquote. Hulme goes on to argue that we have to rethink our discourses about climate change in terms of 4 enduring myths. First is the Edenic myth, which talks about climate change through the language of lament and nostalgia for a much simpler and innocent era. Second is the apocalyptic myth, which is presented through the language of fear and catastrophe and reveals our endemic worries. Third is the Promethean myth, which talks about climate as something we must control, revealing our desire for dominance and mastery through managerial technofix. And finally, fourth is the Themesian myth, named after Greek goddess of natural law and order, in which climate change becomes an idea around which calls for environmental justice are announced, revealing human urge to rights and wrongs. In parallel to the recent debates on climate change, one could say that these myths have also infiltrated into architecture and urban discourses. While new visualization platforms such as Google Earth, geometric information systems, have helped to reconceptualize the scale of architecture production from that of the building to that of larger terrains, contemporary architecture conceptions of the environment are mostly limited to discussions of environmental management and efficiency, with an over-reliance on the positivist knowledge of expertise, problem solving, and the sister concept data. While revealing architecture's desire to engage with the realities of the world, these tendencies limit architecture's unique capacities to imagine alternative worlds into a narrow negotiation between efficiency and performance.
The question is, what if reality that is presented to us by data is not entirely real, but is instead nothing more than an agglomeration of representations in themselves, and that quote-unquote raw data is already deemed as an oxymoron? Second, as argued by media theorist Jussi Parikka, what if there is no data without geology? Parikka writes, quote, "Data demand ecology. One is that's not merely a metaphorical techno-ecology, but demonstrates dependence on climate, the ground, and the energy circulating in the environment." Unquote, reminding us that big data is a material entity with the effects of survey requirements on local land, ecologies, or labor markets. Correspondingly, rather than seeing environment as something merely systemic and therefore needing to be managed and maintained, or purely natural, needing to be preserved and protected, can we instead talk about an alternative kind of geographic imagination architecture that projects environment as aesthetic and offers a renewed and a more nuanced dialogue between the representational and the material? In the context of discussions on climate change and the new geological agency posited by the Anthropocene, I'm interested in the potential of unfamiliar aesthetic couplings between realism and abstraction, instead of limiting our agency to the managerial. Our Museum of Lost Volumes project, a geo-architecture fiction and a satire commentary on resource extraction, provides an alternative focus on the mining of rare earth minerals. As a museum built after the depletion of rare earth minerals in the world, after their abundant use with green technologies, it speculates on the preservation of geographic ruins that once belonged to the resource extraction of rare earth minerals mining. Since rare earth minerals are the backbone substance that is used in clean energy technologies such as wind turbines, electric batteries, and solar panels, the project questions the idea of resource scarcity in the abundance of green technologies. It imagines a museum of ancient resource extraction ruins for a time when mining is an obsolete practice and treated similarly to an ancient monument or an extinct species to be housed in a museum. While rendering the geographic scale as a tangible entity, it aims to construct an alternative relationship between legibility and abstraction through the limits and potentials of design thinking. Juxtaposing an inquiry on matter and formlessness with monumentality and composition, the project is comprised of 5 drawings, which all depict specific aspects of this imaginary museum. In his book, Romantic Rocks, literary theorist Noah Harrigan shows how the development of disciplinary geology in the Romantic era created a very specific, quote-unquote, aesthetic geology, a material and aesthetic appreciation towards rocks as they embodied formlessness in their composition and dramatized the recurrence of raw matter and triggered relationships between picturesque and geology. In the context of the new geological epoch posited by the Anthropocene, another project, which is, I should call a research project because we have started, matters around architecture. An ongoing research project, for instance, aims to develop this question of aesthetic geology. It looks into wider connections between resource, extraction, production, consumption, and disposal in relation to most expensive building construction materials, ranging from certain types of marble, granite, steel, copper, wood, to specific types of leather used in interior finishes, and the connection to their raw matter, quarries, forests, cows. Here, represented as an archipelago of 11 islands floating in the objective space of the axonometric drawing, each island is made up from a particular building material. By juxtaposing the finished surfaces of the typologically simplified archetypical monuments at the top of each island with the vulgar rawness and formlessness of the naked landmass below, the research project calls attention to the under-conceptualized space in between. Our recent straight installation exploits similar contestations between the geographic and the architectural. It presents a geographical feature as a withdrawn monolith and aims to open up a range of aesthetic and political concerns for architecture imagination and the broader public. The installation was at view at the South Gallery this summer between May and August. I will spend more time. I gave those projects, the 2 beginning ones as teasers, but I'm going to dwell on this project a little bit more. To give the background of that. In March 1994, a dramatic accident occurred in the Bosphorus Strait. Nasia, a 100,000-ton tanker carrying crude oil from Russia, collided with a cargo ship at the northern exit of the strait. The cargo ship exploded and ran aground, while Nasia immediately caught fire and released more than 13,000 tons of oil into the sea. The fire continued for weeks, causing a devastating environmental disaster. This accident marked a delicate moment in the history of the Bosphorus Strait. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of the Caspian oil reserves in the 90s, the strait became one of the 6th busiest oil shipping choke points in the world, along with Suez Canal, Straits of Malacca, Bab el-Mandeb, the Straits of Hormuz, and Straits of Dover. Compared to the other trade routes, however, here you see the Bosphorus right there. You can compare the scale of it. The Bosphorus Strait is unique as one of the narrowest and most urbanized, as it passes through the heart of Istanbul, a city of 14 million citizens. To complicate matters even further, the geographic form of the strait, with its sharp and narrow turns, makes it one of the most risky and difficult channels to navigate in the world. To do so, vessels must change their course at least 12 times, with turning angles reaching to 80 degrees at times. Despite the seriousness of the risk, contemporary environmental concerns regarding the transit of colossal oil tankers through this navigational route have been conflicted with the controversies around transnational energy pipelines and various other large-scale infrastructure and urban transformation projects, such as the promotion of the transnational Baku-Tiflis-Ceyhan pipeline as an alternative route to transit the Caspian oil through the Bosphorus Strait in the 90s. And more recently, the risk associated with the tanker passage through the strait is used as a pretext for the construction of the controversial Canal Istanbul project, a massive, I should say a joke, not a project, but it is a project, a massive 30-mile long man-made canal that will act as an alternative route between the Black Sea and the Marmara Sea. The strait installation brings this framework to architectural and urban imaginaries by manifesting the narrow strait through the tangible experience of an installation object. Invading the entrance floor of the gallery as an out-of-scale monolith, the installation introduces the idea of the geographic object as an extrusion of the Bosphorus Strait shoreline to the height of the gallery ceiling without articulating its topography. The visitor's pathway through the installation evokes the narrowness of the Bosphorus Strait within the language of architecture. The object is scaled so that the tightest point in the strait measures 90 centimeters, the minimum dimension for a door opening. In this way, the object renders the Bosphorus as a constricted experiential condition. Instead of treating geographic information merely as raw data, Stray reenacts objectification and the role of spatial demarcation to articulate a more nuanced interaction between aesthetics and geography. As an abstraction of geographic information and as a empirical phenomenon, the object renders the Bosphorus simultaneously more tangible and more abstract. To amplify the contestation between architecture and geographic scale, the installation reconstructs the crenellated shorelines of the Bosphorus with locally used crown molding, carton-pierre, section profiles, commonly used as interior ceiling ornamentation in Istanbul. By collapsing the vertical extrusion of geographic information with the horizontal extrusion of a ceiling ornamental profile, the shorelines become both more tangible and more abstracted at an architectural scale. While utilizing the elemental technique of horizontal and vertical geometric extrusions, the project sets out a new dialogue, as though, this is going to be more evident to an architectural audience, but bear with me. Super Studio's horizontal extrusion of New York profile from the Continuous Monument project of 1969, suddenly starting speaking with Mies van der Rohe's vertical charcoal extrusion of the plan at his glass skyscraper project of 1922. As part of the exhibition, the installation object is also accompanied with the presentation of a geographic fiction, a story illustrated through a series of speculative architectural drawings and presented in the form of a silent film. The story depicts an incident in 2025 when Oilella, a fictional oil tanker, the biggest fictional oil tanker in the world, gets stuck in the Bosphorus. This incident not only blocks the passageway forever, but also causes the Bosphorus to be transformed into a new land of urban development. In the story, while some structures on the Bosphorus turn into touristic destinations, depicting an archaeology of an oil shipping landscape, new developments take advantage of this rapidly urbanizing land. For new construction, building codes get created by taking Oilella as a guiding for the most historical structure. And monuments get built to commemorate previous oil spills on the spot where they happened. Finally, the installation object of the Strait exhibition or installation is presented as one of those monuments built to commemorate the original shoreline that dissolved after the infill. In an era where humans are described as geological agents, architecture is both a background and a measure against which the world might be read. Like architecture, then, these investigations aim to represent the world back to itself and instigate potentials beyond. Thank you.
You can also switch the cards if that's easier.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I should be here because that was the norm and I changed it. It's complicated about this.
All right, thank you all for an extraordinary set of talks that really test exactly the limits of what I was calling environmental inscriptions in complex and in really challenging ways. So I'm going to ask each of you a question, and then you can decide if you want to answer it or not, or you want to answer somebody else's, or refuse to answer. Entirely up to you. But my questions are going to be organized around molecules and tropes. So for Heather and Laura, there was a surprising relationship between, it's something that could be described as the environmental aesthetic of particles. And in Heather, your talk, this was quite specifically organized around the molecule. And what I want to ask is this, that this morning we heard how capital produces its own ecology. It doesn't just have a relationship to ecology, there's an ecology that emerges from capital. So we could also say that your description of the regime of molecules is a kind of molecular ecology related to capital. And the projects that you showed act on those molecules in complex and interesting ways, primarily by making, let's say, our relationship to that molecular regime known through how molecules are quite literally incorporated. And so my question is this: if there's an ecology of capital molecules, do you see in these projects something else? Do you see in these projects a kind of counter model, or let's say a counter molecular ecology that somehow pushes against that inherited capital ecology of molecules? And I think this raises all kinds of complex questions about what the scale of environment is and what the detail of environment is, which might in fact be molecular. And Laura, in your project, I'm going to say again, all of these stunning talks and stunning projects, the one feature is your aggressively unapologetic production of visual rhetoric. And by this, I mean that you refuse the bodies, you refuse all of the conventions of depiction of both environmental crisis and and environmental terror. And it's translated into a kind of informational visual system. And the only particle, or sorry, the affinity to Heather's talk, I think, is the way the particle shows up. But here the particle is the body. So there's a relationship of molecule as informational unit, and in your representation, the molecule as a similar type of informational unit. But here it's the only sign of the body. But what I want to ask is this, is in your project, which seems to be challenging the conventions of description and depiction of the environment, you clearly want to produce a different type of legibility of environment, a different type of knowing or knowability. And in doing this, you clearly produce something like a forum, a rhetorical forum in which environment is known differently. And in doing this, you said that you curated the data sets. And I'm incredibly interested in how you think about that act of curating as the construction of a rhetorical, environmental, political forum. What's at stake within that curating? And so switching more fully into trope mode, the sad fate of the polar bear as the, let's say, the environmental synecdoche. And it was a beautiful pairing, the way let's say, the tragic polar bear versus the tragic planet seems to be a kind of exhausted trope that maybe no longer registers because of pre-traumatic stress. But somehow the polar bear doesn't figure as a successful synecdoche. And yet, as you've told us, the problem, the representational conundrum is that climate change is everything, right? There's a complex totality to climate change that every representational system, every trope has to come up against. And in your really beautiful reading of the Amy Balkin project, what becomes disarticulated is that environmental totality. We understand climate change is inscribed within complex systems of negotiation, of policy, of speech acts, et cetera. And so it's accumulated rather than total. But my question would be that in your championing of that model, what happens to that environmental totality that was the representational conundrum that you started with? Do we just set that aside as an unnecessary problem? And if not, what would be the upgrading of the polar bear? What would be, maybe this is a lot to ask, but what would be the adequate synecdoche for that totality that is more complex in the way that Amy's project seems to point to? And maybe her project is the answer. Neyran, you're a beautiful set of drawings that, and I'm so happy to hear the term aesthetic geology. I've always had a fascination with the idea of starting not a program of cultural geography, but cultural geology, and it seems like your interests are very close. But really a knowing set of projects, but knowing in, let's say, obviously knowing in terms of in relation to problems of resources and resource extraction and complex histories and sites that you've shown us, but also very particularly knowing in terms of architectural representation. That it seems like one of the sites they continually occupy are the sites of architectural projects and representations that are familiar to us, from Banham to Coolhouse to Super Studio, etc. So I'm wondering a little bit about a similar trope issue. How, in your mind, does the occupying of those architectural representational systems place architecture into these more complex sites, conditions, problematics of resources and resource extraction that your projects want to deal with? Let's say, what is the political utility of those sets of representations? So one, any, all. Yeah.
I have an easy answer. So the curation of the data sets was because the project was about the effect of climate change on people moving around the world. So we had to find data about people, which cut out a lot of other things like molecules, like, you know, the hockey sticks, So, and the data sets that we found are very, they're there, but they're also problematic, but they allowed for a different kind of visualization. And also the project was a global project. So you couldn't suddenly decide you were going to focus on a polar bear, right? So there were constraints built into the project around which we curated the data very critically and, you know, with an awareness of the limits of that data. So, you know, so the unapologetic aesthetic, it's not, you know, I don't think it's so aggressive in the sense of I would never do it another way, but within the limits of that project, that was the choice, you know, and there were a lot of collaborators sort of in the mix. Yeah.
I can attempt to answer your question. I mean, for me, one of the things when I was thinking about this was, so actually, you know, my more proper work is on plastic, and one of the things that defines plastic is actually just its molecular components, right? So the way in which we would differentiate a plastic molecule rather than something else has nothing to do with its phenotypic qualities, and I thought that was really endemic to a particular way of approaching the kind of abstractedness of data, especially around climate change in relationship to something like carbon dioxide. And so when I was talking to Tarika and she was asking the question, what does it mean to have an intimate relation to carbon? And of course, you know, we all have this very bodily connection to that particular molecule. We wouldn't exist, obviously, without it. I think it brought up an entirely different kind of scale. It brought up an entirely different way of thinking about these problems. And so, in a certain sense, I don't think that the projects that I presented are necessarily outside of the, how did you phrase it, the capitalist, the project of capitalist ecologies, or the project of capitalism as a particular ecology. I think that they're addressing that from within. But at the same time, I think what they're doing is putting a certain kind of valence on it that in a way, at least for me, approaches it from a perspective that both allows us to attune ourselves to the coming realities, and also allows us to do so in a way that doesn't end up in that kind of dysphoric paralysis that Emily, you were talking about, and especially Susanna Hertrich's project, because it's so playful. You know, there's something really imminent, obviously, about it. Like, you know, she did it in Beijing, where there's such high air pollution levels, and so clearly, you know, it's meant as a real prosthetic apparatus to actually augment our sensors, which is necessary in the stakes of climate change, but done so in a way that I think allows us to attune ourselves without becoming paralyzed.
I can go. I think for me there are actually two circles in that conversation. One is an internal one. By internal, I mean a conversation within the discipline. For certain drawings, I'm sure they're communicating to architects in the room differently than to people who are not in design fields. That's one. And I feel that's important as well. I'm going to touch that. But the second thing is also a form of engagement. So using the space of the architectural drawing as a way of engagement, so that either through, in this case, the first one was presented for a competition. The second, the installation actually requires a kind of physical presence in space, so there are different kind of degrees of engagement. But I'm interested in both, I think, circles. So for the first one, let me touch the first one, because I feel like if I start with the other one, I might not be able to get to disciplinary one. With the disciplinary conversation, I think it's both a critique and a projection in a way. One is that I am interested in realism, but not in a way that we would talk about it directly, like problem solving, super realism in the way that you say these are the facts and here's what we need to do. And also I'm not so much interested in let's say science fiction, in the say that I'm creating these apocalyptic stories which might be a film and it's fine, people watch and go, but I'm interested in the dialectic in between. When I say a relationship between realism and abstraction, that's what I'm grappling with. That's the place I'm interested in. So that the images or the stories, representations, even within an architectural circle, they are not so far away in the sense like a sci-fi film. And also, they're a little bit far away. They're maybe near future. So they're close enough as a fact, but a little bit distorted, a little bit defamiliarized for you to be maybe more engaged with the drawing. So this is a space I'm really broadly interested in. That's why I sometimes call these drawings slightly unfamiliar, but I didn't want to get into that in context of this discussion. And the second thing is, which I think is really related to the concept of Anthropocene, what interests me about it is I know it's a cliche word, but thinking long span, to be able to understand not deep history, but also to be able to project. But within that realm, I'm again not so much going back to the same moment of, by projection, I don't mean let's create just funky stories and talk about them of what would be the worst thing about climate change. If we don't do anything, this will happen. But more that actually to be able to talk about obsolescence, to be able to understand projects, architecture projects even sometimes, as things that might accommodate points of flexibility, but not in the way that we were thinking in the 60s or 70s, but a kind of let's say a dialectic between, let's say, certain new spectrums of flexibility that we would be able to talk about. And finally, I think that that's the kind of direct answer. I am seeing these representations or projects, let's say, installations, as places of engagement. I think that they have so when there's a slight distortion in reality, even I remember in the installation, Straits installation this summer, some people came to me in Istanbul, they're like, is there an Oyalella, like a tanker? So it's like that, just not so much the visual language, because for a non-architectural, non-designer audience, they might not understand the techniques, the kind of montage of certain kind of histories, but more of the story itself. If it's slightly distorted, they know that it's actually possible. Somebody even asked me, did that happen? Like, did it get stuck? Or, so I think there's a place I'm interested in, a kind of slight, really, or a moment of pause, and that might create a kind of trigger a certain conversation about certain things I'm interested in.
Our time is flashing, but I'm going to ignore it to allow us to hear from
I don't have time to say anything, which would be okay too, but there were a lot of pieces to your question. I'll just say a couple of things. So the crux of your question maybe was, in a project like Balkans, where does the totality or like the sort of global or the planetary go? And I think that was part of your question. And
more for you than for
then one of my questions or response questions is then, like, was it ever there? And so, you know, one problem with a global perspective, I was quite amazed in your visualizations, the way you were able to hold kind of suspend in the same space, both the global and these bodies. Like, I was like, how is that even possible technological? Like, your technological know-how and the fact that the technology exists to produce that visualization kind of blew me away. But anyway, so I think one problem with a global kind of perspective or satellite perspective is that, of course, as you get further away, things become flattened. But it also, you know, sort of turns, which you've written about as well, it turns the sort of Earth into an object and the object of a gaze, and into something which is both kind of a thing, an object, but also is like heavily naturalized. So in that sense, there's another connection I didn't point out between the polar bear and the globe. Just they both really sort of move any kind of discussion or consideration of climate change into a denaturalized realm. And that's really ultimately maybe where my kind of my problem with those representations sort of stems from. So to get to the latter part of your question, my attraction to the Balkan project, and it isn't the only example, I think it's a really good one. What I love about the project, and I would say in some ways it's an updated or sort of more adequate version than the polar bear, and that it does involve a kind of pathos, which I think is important. Which, for instance, well, maybe some of the other works we saw too. Yours is less so, but there is a real melancholy to that project, which I find very affective and effective. But the way that it sort of addresses a very large scale, but in a way that maintains particularity and specificity, embeddedness, materiality, it doesn't become a totalizing image. It firmly resists the totalizing. And just as a side note, my own class, which I just finished teaching, her project was really a model for me that I had in mind for a couple of years. I conceptualized that class for a very long time. It was a really challenging kind of design project, a pedagogical design project to think how to teach climate change. In part because of these very questions this conference is posing about at what scale do you even begin to approach something. And so I really in the class, by trying to parse out these sort of uneven, messy case studies that had complicated relations to each other, and sort of the idea was also that my students and I together would sort of help to build kind of more concrete entry points into something without simplifying or flattening these perspectives. So.
Thank you all. And we are now taking a break. And you're all going to have to hold your questions for the break. Yeah.
Thanks so much, everyone. That's fantastic. Just want to let you know we're taking a